Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to this week's podcast. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I'm actually at Seeley Lake in northern western Montana, about 80 miles from Missoula. A fabulous lake. My friend Dennis and I went today to this beautiful waterfall. It's a 2.5-mile hike in, and then the waterfall was just unbelievable. This gem that we've never heard about. I've been there once before, long ago. But we went there. It was a perfect day. Came back. We've had a little technical glitch with one of the recorders, and I so apologize to everybody for that. But now we have solved that problem, and I think we will be on an even keel here. But David Nicandri, and I recorded a program about my journey and sort of conclusions about Lewis and Clark in my Airstream at Olympia. In Washington when I was finishing up out there, but there was this buzz and click, and so we redid it today. And actually, the one we did today was better in substance and in pace than the one that we had done earlier. So I'm very glad for that. And questions we attended to were these: why is this story so important? Why do we have several dozen interpretive centers to Lewis and Clark across the country, and essentially none to Zebulon Pike or John C. Fremont or others? So why is this story so powerful in the American memory? It has something to do with Stephen Ambrose, and it has something to do with Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns. It has a lot to do with Thomas Jefferson and, of course, Sacagawea. We also talked about Lewis's silences. Why was Lewis silent? And particularly, why was Lewis silent when they finally reached the Pacific Ocean around November 15th, 1805? That's one you can't not write about. That's one you must write about, and Lewis didn't. Lewis's silences are one of the principal problems of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I've written about it in my book, Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness. I invite you to take a look at it. I think the first sentence of my chapter on that is, it's the silences that killed Lewis, not only during the expedition, but not communicating with the War Department or with Jefferson when he was out in St. Louis as the territorial governor. David Nicandri has written about this in a book yet to be published by Washington State University Press. And so both of us are fascinated by this. And we have theories of the dynamics of the journals and whether these were primary documents or derivative secondary documents and so on. It's just a joy to have a friend like David Nicandri, who's as fascinated by all of this as I am and skeptical of the received tradition. And his book, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, is a must read for anyone interested in this story. I won't say my book is must read, but I would like it to be, of course. The Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness. We're sort of the bad boys of the Lewis and Clark studies, because we challenge some of the received myths that Lewis and Clark were the best friends who ever lived, that they had completely harmonious relations with each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of what I would call the patriot historians who just want to gush about the greatness of Lewis and Clark sometimes are disappointed that we challenge some of those received myths, but they need to be challenged, I think. And Nicandri has done really important work in this regard all of his career. And there's another Lewis and Clark book yet to be published, which I'm editing for Washington State University Press. And I have a new book that I'm working on and intend to finish by this time next year, working title, Getting Noticed on the Lewis and Clark Trail. I'm really excited about that. If I do it well, I think it will shape future Lewis and Clark discourse. That's thrilling to me. I also edited the Journals of Lewis and Clark for the North Dakota segment. It's the only state-based edition of Lewis and Clark. They spent more time in North Dakota than in any other state. During that time, in my edition, I have what everybody wrote on every day, so that you don't have to read volume 2 for Lewis and Clark and then 6, 7, or 8 for the others. It's all in one day, including the weather report for that day, including any letters that they wrote at that time. It's the first edition ever to be comprehensive day by day, everything that was written on that day. And I think that's absolutely important, because otherwise you're not going to read volumes 11, volume 10, volume 9. You'll just spot check them. But if you see it all there, that's provocation to really dig in and triangulate this thing. I will say that the University of Nebraska's online edition covers everybody every day, which is exactly how it should be. But the print edition follows a more traditional path of Lewis and Clark early on, and then the lesser journal keepers towards the end. And I think that creates a dislocation of the multiple voices, multiple perspectives, multiple insights that come from reading them all on the day that they wrote. Anyway, I have so much joy in knowing David Nicandri. We did this on Zoom and we're just laughing and smiling through the whole. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Join the Friends group, join the book club, contribute to us to the extent that you're comfortable with. We need your help. My friend Dennis, who's my boss, and I are here at Seeley Lake in northern Montana, trying to wrestle through the plans for the next few years. The Airstream will continue to be in the picture, but maybe not in a linear way, as we have done the first 2 years. I've got books to write. We've got many, many projects. It's all very exciting, and lots of surprises, I think, are coming in the next 18 months. And so stay tuned. I'll be announcing them as they come. So let us go to the show. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I have the great pleasure of being across virtually from my friend, Mr. David Nicandri. You all know David Nicandri. He's our Enlightenment correspondent here at first the Jefferson Hour and now Listening to America, formerly the executive director of the Washington State Historical Society. He has 4 books: Discovering Nothing in Pursuit of an Elusive Northwest Passage. That's about Captain Cook. Another one about Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie. And then the book that made him most prominent in the Lewis and Clark world, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. So welcome, my friend David Nicandri.
Thanks, Clay. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
20 years ago, we were good friends, and you had written an introduction here and an introduction there and so on, edited a book about the search for the Northwest Passage and so on. But now suddenly 4 books and more in the works.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, Clay. I was thinking over Labor Day. I can remember kind of a gloomy Labor Day of early September, maybe 1980, 81. And I was just kind of looking out, watching the cedar waxwings eat the mountain ash berries. And I was thinking how productive they are and how what I had always wanted to do, what I had fashioned as a potential career, seemed to be slipping from my grasp. I mean, I was then working in museums, and I had a great career in historical administration. It's really made everything else possible. So I don't really begrudge that. But my gnawing sense was that my professors, when I was a student, as an undergrad and in graduate school, thought I had a lot of potential as a writer, and I wasn't doing any. And thanks to your almost providential intercession around 2005, I mean, I wrote some, like you say, some odds and ends, nothing particularly noteworthy, but you rescued that first Lewis and Clark manuscript, and that got me started. So I also did the anthology on Cook. So that's 5 books in the last 15 years. And I'm hoping with you to get another one out with WSU Press, Northwest. Yeah, I've got, and maybe the pièce de résistance, my Arctic monograph at some point. So at least one more, maybe 2.
And you have inspired me. So just so everyone knows, I mean, these are your books entirely. At a certain point with the first one, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, I was asked to work with you, and I was excited to do so. And you had a very large manuscript, and it needed a little work. And I think I made a list of the 100 whoppers in it, and I talked you down to about 80. And then the book was published as River of Promise. We quarreled a little bit about the title in the best possible creative way. And the book not only won acclaim, but the great James Rhonda said it was maybe the class act of the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark, which I know when I called you with that was one of the great moments of your life as an intellectual.
Yeah, well, let's just get real, Clay. I broke down and cried when I heard that. I was overcome with emotion because the praise from Jim Rhonda was the highest possible commendation. And so, I don't write for a big audience, but I write. I've concluded, and I'm comfortable with this. I write for people who write for larger audiences. I see myself as informing their work. And so it's been a privilege. And as I say, you got me started. I'll always be thankful.
Well, and I'm grateful because, I mean, if I could in any teeny little way be a midwife to this extraordinary second career that you've had, it's really been remarkable. And your two books on Captain Cook have received acclaim also. So we had better get started here. So here's the point. My journey this year from Poplar Forest in Virginia all the way across the country, following the Lewis and Clark Trail, winding up in Olympia, where we had a wonderful afternoon discussing all of this in my Airstream trailer. It's been an amazing year, and I've learned a great deal, and I'm now writing more about it. I've got a book in the works on this. It's been one of the great years of my life, Dave, and you've been part of it from the beginning. You've inspired a lot of my ideas about Lewis and Clark. We've collaborated on some important insights, I think, on Lewis and Clark. So I wanted to start this. I wanted to ask this question by way of beginning. Why are Lewis and Clark important? Why are Lewis and Clark important? It's 230 years later. The West has been filled up as early as 1890. Frederick Jackson Turner said the frontier era of American history is over. In other words, we've taken the entire continent and entered into some sort of an uneasy settlement with the Aboriginal peoples who were here. After all of that, the steamboat era, the railroad era, the automobile era, the space races, that's a long, long, long time ago, Dave. So why is this story still important?
Well, there are several reasons, Clay, the way I think of it. First of all, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't point out that one of the compelling reasons for the ongoing popularity of the Lewis and Clark story is its connection to Thomas Jefferson. He's one of the 2 or 3 most influential Americans in history, for reasons that this audience, your audience, needs no elaboration to appreciate. It was sort of like the oldest child in the family album. Those siblings in the cohort always seemed to have the most pictures. And so it was the first big government-sponsored expedition in American history. So there's the primacy of effort factor. And I think thirdly, and I don't know if I've actually rendered it in the descending order of priority, is the magnitude of it. Coast to coast, it's another 40 years before an American explorer overland is attempting anything like that, by which time technology's evolved and the governmental infrastructure has become far more substantial. And I guess just to loop back to the Jefferson connection, I think it's the Lewis and Clark stories tied to the Enlightenment ethos, and which, of course, the Enlightenment is a multivariate phenomenon. It's moral philosophy, it's science, it's exploration. Lewis and Clark fit into that in an obvious way. So Lewis and Clark is circumscribed, if you will. It's surrounded by other highly valued associated phenomena and people, and I think that all of that contributes to its ongoing. The American public's ongoing interest in the story.
Yeah, just to recapitulate that, I couldn't agree more. I'm talking to David Nicandri, the author of a number of books, 2 of them on Lewis and Clark, 2 of them on Captain Cook, and more to come. We are old, dear friends in the Republic of Letters, and I always so enjoy our conversations. And as I say, you're our Enlightenment correspondent. Together, we've covered eclipses and transits of Venus and a range of other phenomena that fit into the Enlightenment. So Jefferson was certainly, I think, America's greatest exemplar of the Enlightenment, possible exception, Dr. Franklin, but the 2 of them really are. Hamilton really isn't an Enlightenment figure. Washington isn't an Enlightenment figure. John Adams, they all had fingers in it, but none of them swallowed that whole worldview in the way that Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin did. Go ahead.
Well, the way I would correlate that, Clay, is that of all the people you mentioned, only Franklin, who was, and Jefferson, if he had wanted to be, would have qualified and would have been nominated and elected to membership in the Royal Society in Great Britain alone. Only those 2.
It's a pity that Jefferson wasn't elected, but he was an Anglophobe, among other things, and had said some pretty nasty things about George III and the British ministry and so on. But at any rate, Jefferson carries that, and Lewis carries some of that from Jefferson. But England was not the U.S. As you said, England had a huge scientific and intellectual infrastructure and a publishing industry that could absorb Captain Cook's discoveries and find ways to get illustrators and ghostwriters and map makers and bookbinders. And so he had a whole set of tools and support structures that it's fair to say were in there, were being birthed in the United States at this time, but were not yet ready to absorb the kind of report that Lewis really wanted to have written.
Yes, and let's recall, Clay, because there's a figure who kind of bridges these two worlds, and we've talked about him in previous episodes under the Jefferson Hour auspices, and now this. That's John Ledyard, who sailed with Cook, but was an American, published a book in the United States about Cook's final voyage, and that was the first copyrighted work in American history,
Really?
1783.
That was the first copyright. Copyright was just sort of barely being born at this time.
Yes. And that just speaks to the nascent quality of the American intellectual apparatus on the cusp of the 18th century as Jefferson became president, which in a way also, just to turn it back to a more positive casting, speaks really to, makes the expedition all the more remarkable because with as little going for it as it had in some respects, it still got a lot done. There are other factors, but I think those are the key ones.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And so you talked about Jefferson's naivete, and I agree with you. But there was also a sort of Jefferson presumption. He assumed that Lewis was fully capable of sitting down and writing several learned volumes and producing this manuscript. Lewis, published a really sort of heroic, almost over-the-top prospectus in 1807. Jefferson could have stepped in and said, well, I don't know if we can really pull that off, but just how about write your account and we'll start from there. So I think Jefferson believed that everyone was as capable as he was. Everyone could write with as much facility as he did. Everyone had as capacious a mind as he did. Everyone has as optimistic a spirit and productivity as he did. And it wasn't true. It wasn't true for poor Meriwether Lewis, who was a very complicated man beset by enormous self-doubts and self-destructive tendencies. Yeah, so we need to take a break, David Nicandri, but just to wrap that up, Jefferson wrote his classic book, his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, which is an extraordinary encyclopedia of America. Well, you know, and I know how hard writing a book is. And Meriwether Lewis was a gifted writer, but he didn't have that kind of daily discipline that Jefferson just assumed. And that's where I want to pick up after the break. Meriwether Lewis's Silences and Their Implications. We're listening to a special edition of Listening to America with David Nicandri. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to this very special and very enjoyable edition of Listening to America. I'm looking out on a lake in northwestern Montana. I'm on my way back to North Dakota after 4 perfect days canoeing on the Missouri River from Judith Landing, named after Clark's future wife, Julia Hancock, to James Kipp Recreation Area. I've never been on that section before, David. One of my goals has always been to get you onto that river. You and your son go on heroic journeys to sources of rivers and to the Arctic and all over the place. I would love to get you out there because I think if you were there and you and I were talking around the campfire, one of two things would be true. It would be one of the best nights of our guests' lives, or they would go to bed at about 7 and you and I would talk through the night all alone about it.
Yeah, and I might be with them as I'm getting up there. Well, never say never, Clay. We'll just have to hold that out as a future possibility.
I would love it. I also want to get you to the British Museum. I also want to float on the Northwest Passage across the top of Canada with you. And I wouldn't do it with anybody else because you are the Northwest Passage man. So they traveled 7,000 or almost 8,000 miles. They only lost one of their own men, Charles Floyd, to natural causes early on, August 20th, 1804, near Sioux City, Iowa. There's an obelisk in his honor. They're almost as impressive as the Washington Monument. They met more than 50 tribes or sub-tribes along the way. They took vocabularies of 20 or 30 different tribes. Unfortunately, many of those lost. They took down ethnographic data wherever they went. They had some discipline problems early on, but that seemed to all have been worked out after the first year of travel. They had 3 winters, one at across the mouth of the Missouri in Illinois. That was 1803-04. Then they wintered amongst the Mandan Hidatsa natives in North Dakota, 1804-05. And then finally out in your part of the world at Fort Clatsop among the Chinook and Clatsop peoples in 1805 and early 1806. They went all the way out and they had to come all the way back. And as they come all the way back, they were really pretty destitute of trade goods and anything else that would help them. But when they got back, they had enough gunpowder and lead to make the trip all over again. By any account, this was an incredibly successful land reconnaissance. I should say, though, just to make sure that that we don't omit this, that they did wind up in a skirmish with 8 young Piegan Blackfeet, and in that unfortunate encounter in self-defense, Lewis and his 3 other men killed at least one of these young men and maybe 2. That's the only actual bloodshed that we know of the expedition, and I think Jefferson would have been very sorry about that. I think Lewis made a strategic error there, Dave, and didn't take enough men. Probably shouldn't have been there at all at that point, but he took too few men, and they were jumped at dawn by these young men who were really just counting coup, trying to have their first great adventure and get maybe a rifle from these Yankees. But it all went south, and there was some killing.
A year earlier, at almost that same geographic intersection, that is to say, when going upstream, they got to the Great Falls of the Missouri, Lewis and Clark toyed with the idea of sending some of the men back from that point. They had already sent some men back the previous spring from North Dakota, what's now North Dakota. He thought about it again then, but then he thought going really out into terra incognita, they thought the better of it and kept the whole group together. So his instincts in this regard were generally good, but in that particular instance, I think he was and some people would say this is characteristic of explorers deep into their voyage. They get a little overconfident, a little careless, maybe a little fatigued. This, of course, is the argument with Cook on his 3rd voyage. So maybe he wasn't processing information as well as he could have.
So you're, of course, referring to the death of Captain Cook in Hawaii on the 3rd voyage, and maybe he was a little careless, maybe he was a little weary, maybe he was a little cocky, having survived so many other skirmishes successfully. And I think you could certainly make the case that Lewis was a little overconfident by now and really ready to be home and assumed that his good luck would hold, as it always had. It did not in this instance, and we won't go into this, but the reason that he was there was as a creature of the Enlightenment. He was trying to establish a tributary coming from what we call Canada, British North America, because if he could find a south-flowing tributary from Alberta or possibly even Saskatchewan, British Columbia, he reckoned that could help drive the British border back. And I think there's one of those instances, Dave, where I think he took Jefferson too seriously. I think if he had had a cell phone and had called Jefferson and said, look, we're kind of scrambling. Clark's on the Yellowstone. I'm here. We've got a lot of things going on. Some horses were stolen. We're pretty weary. We're out of almost everything. I'm thinking about going up to check out the Canadian border here and see if the Marias is a Canadian river. I think Jefferson would have said, no, I think you've done enough here. I wouldn't strain yourself.
Well, it was of a piece with the late Enlightenment, where the geographic quest turned from the general outlines of the globe's continental construction into what you have felt, your insight, you've called it the river source hunting phase of the late Enlightenment, and it was a part of that phase of the Enlightenment. But it was also, Clay, I think you'd be quick to agree, there was a nationalist or geostrategic aspect of that too, because the whole point of reaching the interface with British interests, what you called Canadian, was to make up for, in some respects, two features that had preceded it, one immediately in American history and one going back to the end of the Revolutionary War. The one related, the one most immediate to Lewis and Clark was the fact that he didn't quite find the Northwest Passage, river to river, across the Continental Divide connection that geographic lore had suggested he might have, and so he could countervail that by expanding the reach of the American domain, because the entire Missouri River watershed was American terrain, and if he could push that north, all the better. So that's where the
So that might have compensated for the lack of a Northwest Passage. Hey, I have good news. We didn't find a Northwest Passage, but it's not going to be the 49th parallel. It's going to be the 52nd.
Yeah, exactly. The Missouri River drainage goes all the way to the 51st, 52nd parallel.
And that would be great news to bring back to Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, and the more aged factor is the whole business about the Lake of the Woods and the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, because the northwestern boundary in 1783, the treaty was an imaginary line from a corner of the Lake of the Woods to the headwaters of the Mississippi. But the presumption at the time of the treaty was that the Mississippi River went farther north than it does. And so the Americans were always kind of disappointed with that. And therefore, if the Missouri River, by virtue of the Louisiana Purchase, could make up for it 20 years later, all the better. And I think that was the impulse behind the Marias River quest.
And just one last little footnote to this, Dave. So it was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams that when the Louisiana Purchase Treaty was going through the Senate, held up that portion of it, said we're not going to define that too carefully. We don't know enough yet. We want to make sure we are not sacrificing any strategic American or economic interests up there. We'll figure that out later. And when he then became Secretary of State in the Monroe administration, he worked out the 49th parallel and thus raised the border of the United States a couple of 100 miles in doing so, because the source of the Mississippi would cut off about half of North Dakota, half of Montana, half of Washington and Idaho, and the panhandle of Idaho.
Yeah, one of the best known lines in American history is the 49th parallel. That was John Quincy Adams's convention of 1818 doing. The Lake Itasca. And I only learned recently.
You and I have both been to the source at Lake Itasca. The correct
pronunciation is Lake Itasca, is about the 47th parallel. So a line from the Lake of the Woods at 49 would have veered in a pronounced southwesterly direction. So the Louisiana Purchase, and to a lesser extent the Marias, kind of rescued that little fault line in American statecraft, but it all worked out in the end.
And of course, the second most important latitude and longitudinal number in American history is 5440 or bust. At one time in the mid-19th century, the United States was in a very confident and expansive mode and thought they might be able to drive the border all the way up to Juneau. That did not happen. All right, so let's get to the question of the day, and that is silence. So you and I have both written separately about this. We've talked about it endlessly. I can give everyone this much beginning information. 5 people are known to have kept journals that we have. Clark kept a daily journal, or what amounts to a daily journal, for the entire expedition, except for about 9 days during a blizzard when he was out hunting in North Dakota. We can forgive that. And he summarized them when he returned on the 9th or 10th day. John Ordway, one of the 3 sergeants, and really the third in command from an Army point of view, kept a daily journal and never missed a day. Meriwether Lewis, who was instructed by Thomas Jefferson to keep excellent records and to make copies of them at times of leisure and so on, is missing for 441 days. So half the time Lewis is missing. And you and I have worked this out long since. Lewis early on, I think, decided that if he or Clark was keeping a journal, that was sort of the captain's log, and that was adequate. That maybe he could be relieved of some of that duty because he had other important things going on. But the fact is that Lewis failed in some important respects as a journal keeper. And the question that kind of circulates around is, why was Lewis silent, and can it be explained? And I remember reading Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage, and he says the first time that really becomes an issue, there are almost certainly lost journals. I don't think so. I think there might be some lost field notes, but I think they would be very cursory. I think the simple fact is that Lewis did not write for half of the expedition, and I think we can sort that out a little bit. So I'll hand it to you. He didn't write between St. Louis and North Dakota, and there's an easy answer for that one, right?
Yeah, this conundrum falls into what I would call planned or easily explainable silences, and then there's the inadvertent smack your head silences that you just say,
perplexing, inexplicable, crazy silences.
And so the first one, actually there was a silence, if you think about it, Clay, even going down the Ohio Valley. Lewis got off to, if this was a pattern, he got off to an early start. But the first one that's generally conceived to be an oversight is going up the Missouri River the first season, the spring, summer, fall of 1804. To me, that's easily explained. Like you said, Ordway and Clark can keep the captain's log. They can draw a map from that record, and I think Lewis might very well have been embarrassed to be keeping a detailed record on that stretch, because he had in the employ of the expedition at that point about a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half fur traders whose fathers and grandfathers had been plying the Missouri River from St. Louis to the Mandan villages for well over 100 years. And so for Lewis to be kind of, striking this heroic pose with pen in hand as he's recording his first encounter with this landscape would have struck them as being preposterous. So that's the most easily explained silence.
So, I mean, in some sense, Lewis could have said,
in what sense is this exploration? This is pretty well-traveled country. The rivers have been named. The natives have been met. Some vocabularies have been taken down. Trade relations have been established. Yeah, it's interesting, but it's not discovery in the fullest sense of the term. Therefore, sure, we have to have a record, but I don't feel that I have to really rise to that occasion.
Correct. And there's one other aspect of this, and I'm just shocked at myself that we've gone half an hour into this conversation with my not having invoked Alexander Mackenzie already. But Mackenzie's voyages from Montreal, which in many ways was a template for what Lewis had, and Jefferson too, for that matter, envisioned as the American response to his voyages of discovery for the Northwest Company to the Arctic in 1789 and to the Pacific in 1793. Mackenzie did not begin his accounts of exploration on Lake Superior or Montreal, although it's titled Voyages from Montreal. But both his 1789 account and his 1793 account start at Lake Athabasca, which is north of Edmonton. So
Alberta, all the way far west.
Yes. So Lewis might very well have thought, well, I'm going to start at the upper extent of the Missouri River, just like Mackenzie did on Lake Athabasca. So that's the last bit of explanation for why no Missouri River Journal upstream in 1804.
But two things about that, my friend. One is that you are the pioneer on this. You are the pioneer historian who said, if you want to know how to explain certain things about the Lewis and Clark expedition, you can do nothing more useful than study Alexander Mackenzie's published account of his explorations, because it's not just that Lewis and Clark were familiar with it, they were carrying it, they were in many regards using it as their instruction manual and template, and in some cases they were even plagiarizing it. And you were the one that brought that to the attention of the Lewis and Clark world, and it changes everything. And the second thing to say about that is you are partly, and I know you would be the first to say this, that you were partly inspired by the great James Rhonda, who said, you got to get out from under this one trip. You got to look beyond. You've got to see this in a larger context of exploration and the Europeanization of North America. And if you stay on the river, you're going to get stuck at times. But when you look beyond the ribbon of the river journey itself, and they never really got more than 10 miles perpendicular from any of the rivers, you will begin to see insights that you couldn't otherwise see. And you and I have taken that as almost the charge, the mission statement of future Lewis and Clark studies. And that means that Lewis, you don't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to discover. You have to think, well, what kind of gifts am I going to take to natives? What kind of equipment am I going to need? How many uniforms am I going to have? Should I have pork? Should I have flour? Will there be any attempt to resupply? How do you negotiate with native people who are hostile? Can we hire guides or conductors at any point, and can we rely upon them? How do you announce when you've arrived at a really important place? All those things have been laid down by Captain Cook and by others, and of course by Alexander Mackenzie. And it's not as if you imitate them 100%, but that's your manual of how to figure out how to be an explorer, right?
Exactly. So you're very kind in your attribution of significance to that work. But let me just say this, I've become fond of this kind of phrasing, particularly related to the geostrategic, geographic, diplomatic history component of the Lewis and Clark story, to this effect. The answer is Mackenzie. Now, tell me what the question is.
All right. So silence number one will be on the Ohio River, where he gets a really good start and then peters out. And that made when I retraced the journey this year, when I came to that spot where he stopped, I thought, this is a pattern, Meriwether Lewis. You should have persevered. He didn't. Then he's silent almost entirely, not 100%, but almost entirely from St. Louis to the middle of North Dakota. But we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll just have to disagree about these rival theories of why Lewis went silent. But he did. He went silent in October, and he wrote a couple of entries between then and the spring, but he doesn't really start writing a journal again until January 1st, 1806. We'll try to unpack that in just a moment. I'm talking to David Nicandri, special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. David Nicandri, our Enlightenment correspondent out on the West Coast. A traveler. He's been with his son Dominic to the source of the Columbia River in British Columbia, to the source of the Mississippi River at Lake Itasca in Minnesota, to the source of the Missouri River at Lemhi Pass or Hell Roaring Creek in southwestern Montana, and other rivers. You and I share, I suppose, what most people would regard as a pathetic interest in getting to the sources of rivers. I can't get enough of it. There's something about being, I think you will agree, when you go to Lemhi Pass and you bestride what Lewis called the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri River, it's like the skin on your arm stands up. I mean, there's something. What is that about?
It's hard to explain, Clay. There can't be very many of us. Maybe there's more than we think, but it's a wonderful hobby. It's a great way of traveling around the country. This past year, my son and I did the headwaters of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system, as well as Lake Itasca.
Where is that?
That is, it's called Kelly Lake, which is not far from Hibbing, Minnesota.
I know Hibbing.
Yeah, that's Bob Dylan's hometown.
Robert Zimmerman, you mean?
Yes, I do mean Robert Zimmerman.
So, okay, so you've done all that. And then at the last time we got together, talk about one-upsmanship. I remember when I first did this, I brought you a little jar of water, and I had a label that I printed on it and the source of the Missouri River, and I was so proud of that. And then when I just saw you a few weeks ago, you handed me a grocery bag, a paper bag with like 15 jars of water, and I felt I may as well just retire this competition because you're going to win that. And these are from rivers all over the place.
The one I'm most proud, the one I would value most in that collection, of course, I have a duplicate, Dominic. When we go on these trips, we have 3 little shampoo bottles, one for me, one for him, one for you. And so the one that I'm most proud of that I gave you on that occasion here about a month ago was from the Athabasca Glacier,
Yes.
which is the southernmost extent of the Arctic watershed in all of North America, just south of Jasper National Park.
But we stray. So let's go back to silence. So you will agree. So Lewis is silent for the first year of travel. Then he's very good until they get through the ordeal, and it was an ordeal of the Bitterroot Mountains. Then he goes silent for reasons that we've been trying to sort out. But I think we can agree: exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, physical illness. But he could have picked it up again a few weeks after he got better on the Columbia, but he didn't. Then they get to the Pacific, and this one I can knock out of the park, because on January 1st, 1806, he starts writing again. And Dave, that is, in my mind, clearly a New Year's resolution. Like, oh my goodness, I have failed. What am I going to do? They're blank pages. Sure, Clark and the others did it, but that's Clark and the others. I've got to write this book. Jefferson's going to want this stuff. I don't have it. I better start today and get serious about this thing. And he did. And then he wrote continuously from then until August 12th, 1806, in northwestern North Dakota, the day after he was shot in the buttocks accidentally by his own man. And then he says, I think with some persuasiveness, I think I will suspend my journal here, since I was just shot in the buttocks.
And that's the other easily explainable gap. That is from when he got shot by Cruzat to the end of the voyage, because he's recuperating, he's under care. His wound is having to be dressed and so forth. He's probably lying flat on his stomach, not really even physically in a position to write. So much like going up the Missouri in 1804, going down the lower Missouri in 1806, those are the easily explainable gaps. But again, the big one, by far and away the most significant, from the Nez Perce villages to the mouth of the Columbia River. And we are bereft as a people, I truly believe.
So let me just anticipate the famous Nicandri wine. Your view, and you wrote a book called River of Promise, in which you brought attention to the Columbia Basin side of the expedition in a way that nobody else ever had. I mean, it really was the first book that attempted to really look into things from Weippe Prairie when they came out of the Bitterroot Mountains to the mouth of the Columbia and back again. And you did it in a masterful way. And I was just thrilled to be a small part of all of that. But you have said to me many times that the fact that Lewis was not writing during that critical portion of the expedition is not just a problem for Lewis and Clark and the journals and his responsibilities as an explorer. It's been an ongoing problem for the Pacific Northwest, because it doesn't get the attention it deserves, because the great writer of the expedition was silent.
Correct. Meriwether Lewis could be thought of as the poet laureate of the Missouri River, certainly the upper Missouri River, the Great Falls area in particular, which has development, dams, etc. But the poet laureate for the Columbia, the most scenic, most important culturally to the native people, the area around the Dalles, Oregon. The poet laureate for that stretch of the Columbia River and upstream from there is Woody Guthrie from the 1930s, where the whole ethos is electricity and jobs and
progress.
Yes, and so the whole Columbia River was completely made over. It's probably the typical exaggeration on my part, but in my core belief, I think there's some truth to the fact that if there had been someone like Meriwether Lewis writing about the Columbia in the poetic terms, he frequently wrote about the Missouri, the history of this region, I'm referring to the Pacific Northwest, would in fact have been significantly different.
Okay, and I agree with you about that. We're in total agreement. But for me, it's worse than that, because you could argue that, Clark wrote quite well about all of that, and others were writing about it. Clark, you talked about agitated gut and this swirling stream and natives throwing rocks and pebbles down and watching because they assumed that the canoes would overturn and they would rescue some whatever was left behind in the detritus and so on. Clark does a really good job in a kind of pragmatic way of describing that. But when you get to the Pacific, when you have completed your transcontinental epic journey, Lewis must write an account along these lines. Thus far, I have triumphed over this continent on behalf of Jefferson and the Enlightenment, and after many difficulties and more to come as we try to return, we at last have reached this long-desired place and fulfilled our mission, and I feel that I really can call this my own version of being Captain Cook or Columbus. You know that's what he should have written. Of course he should have written that, and he didn't write anything, nothing. He was miserable. Of course, it was totally miserable. The weather was awful. The river was difficult. Trees were rolling up on their campsites at Dismal Niche. They couldn't tell fog from river, from ocean, from sky. I get it. I mean, it can be miserable out there at Astoria. Rains more than 100 inches per year. I'm sure when he was back in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., Lewis thought of the Pacific as the Malibu Pacific, right? You're looking out on this beautiful water, the surf's coming in, it's 78 degrees. I'm sure that's what he imagined. And what he saw instead was this kind of almost like a postmodern morass where you can't even really know what you're looking at. And you're so profoundly miserable that the idea of taking out a pen and sharpening it and dipping it into an ink pot and finding paper that's not so damp that you can't write on it. I'm sure he just threw up his hands and had no capacity at that point to sort through the misery and I think frankly the disappointment of the Pacific.
Yeah, it can all be summed up really, Clay, the way I think about it. A few choice phrases from the journals. And you've already cited them at some level. So contrast Lewis on the Missouri, scenes of visionary enchantment.
I thought they would never end, says Lewis.
As opposed to William Clark's gut-churning, boiling, swirling.
Agitating gut.
Yes, or William Clark's most famous place name, Dismal Niche, at the mouth of the Columbia. I mean,
because someone looking at us from outside would have to feel commiseration for us and what he calls sympathy.
Yes, yeah. A feeling person would be distressed to see our situation.
And I get that. I've been there in bad weather.
Yeah. So, yeah, two entirely different pictures of the North American West's two greatest streams.
But you will acknowledge that Lewis's failure to write that up. I mean, he had the whole winter. They're there from mid-November until March 23rd. He wrote a great deal during that winter. That was some of his most productive writing time. Mostly it was ethnographical and Enlightenment essays on flora and fauna and native ethnography. But he could at any point have said, I better write some account of having arrived at the Pacific, and he didn't.
Well, in his defense, Clay, and it's highly unusual, as you know, for me to be defending Meriwether Lewis. Usually that's your job in these conversations. But because of his premature death, we don't know what he might have written had he lived, had he had the support that Jefferson failed to provide him. My considered thinking now, 15, 20 years in, is that maybe the reason it's not this reflective, polished version of that stretch of the trail is that Lewis still didn't know what to make of it, didn't know how to explain it. Going up the Missouri from the Mandan villages, that's easily done. Or easily conceived as a narrative job or a task, but how to make sense downstream from the Nez Perce villages. I think the Mackenzie factor is real, and I know we agree to disagree about that. So had he lived, he might have finally lived up to the moment, but regrettably, he did not.
Another one of the insights that you and I share, and is starting to get some valency out in the larger Lewis and Clark community, is that the journals as we have them, with Lewis's fantastic, magnificent prose on the date of departure from Fort Mandan, of seeing the Rocky Mountains for the first time on May 26th, 1805, on reaching the Great Falls and describing them, on reaching meeting Kamehameha of the Shoshone, who was so important for the horses, of reaching the source, what he took to be the source of the Missouri. Those passages are some of the greatest passages in Lewis and Clark, and frankly, they're some of the greatest passages in the history of exploration. I always say, when the switch was on, Lewis was an amazing writer. When the switch was off, we get Clark, who's good and competent, but none of that. But you and I have come to the conclusion, after talking about this endlessly for many years, those were not written in the field. These are polished reconstructions pretending to be a journal entry long after the fact, either at Fort Clatsop or in Philadelphia or somewhere, but that Lewis is taking whatever he has, little field notes or Clark's journal or whatever, and turning them into heroic explorers' prose. That's his book. That's the first draft of the book.
I agree. The larger volume of Meriwether Lewis's text that we see in the Moulton edition, modern Moulton edition of the journals, is actually a second generation literary product. It's clean. He even carries over the first word that's going to appear on the next page at the bottom.
This was a typographical convention of the time, that the bottom of the page, if the word is a time of discovery, then you put discovery there so that when you go to the next page, you know how to pick it up.
So that's a second generation product. And it's commonly stated, as you know, Clay, that Meriwether Lewis never wrote a line, I think is the way it goes. I think
that's what his publisher said. They were wrong.
Much of what we have from Lewis, most of what we actually have from Lewis that came down to posterity is, in fact, a proto-manuscript for the book. But there were the gaps, and there was the whole getting the printing process set up. So this has led to countless misunderstandings. Now, the one that doesn't entail Lewis, but entails William Clark, that I've been working on lately, and you're going to run it and we proceeded on, is
the quarterly journal of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Is the naming of the Judith River, which I maintain was not named in 1805, but probably 1808, maybe even later than that. He got the crazy idea, how about if I name a river after you, honey? Would that convince you to marry me?
Because my good friend Meriwether named a river after a cousin that we have no other knowledge of, Mariah Wood. But yes, I agree with you 100%. I do think that project needs to be done. But just to reinforce that, in Captain Cook, in the published accounts, I think there's a similar thing. Whatever the field notes were have been dressed up as if they were daily journals, right? It's certainly true of John Wesley Powell in the 1869 and 1871 expeditions on the Colorado. When he got to the Grand Canyon, he writes, "Oh my goodness, it's huge. We're about to enter this dungeon." And then the passage in the published account is one of the great passages in Powell, but it was written years later.
Yes. So Cook, of course, could delegate to someone, a midshipman, a sailing master, although he kept a sailing log himself from time to time. But again, what has come down to posterity, what we think of as Cook's journal, all of those entries were sometimes written weeks or months after the events that are described in the account. Famously so, after he left Hawaii the first time, after stumbling upon the islands on his way to the northwest coast, in his journal, the text clearly indicates what I'm writing now. I'm writing in the middle of the North Pacific. All that I'm describing happened weeks ago. So Cook was more overt, was more transparent in that regard. But Lewis and Clark scholars, including a lot of good ones, have been overly reliant on the seeming verisimilitude of the calendar, and it's led to a whole bunch of mistakes of interpretation.
So there's, I think the great bulk of Lewis and Clark lovers and scholars still believe in the Dear Diary approach to this. That at the end of the day, they get out the journals and Lewis writes this heroic account, and that just can't be true. And we know for a fact it's not true, because when they split up sometimes, they write about the others' activities on that day. They couldn't possibly know the others' activities on that day until weeks later, and then they fill in blank pages with it. So in other words, if you read the journals with exacting care, just like trying to figure out the dynamics of it. And Gary Moulton did a really good job in volume 2 of his 13 volumes, but didn't, I think, take it as far as it can be taken. But if you looked at the journals with great exactitude, you would see, oh, yeah, this can't have been written that day. And this assumes knowledge not yet in place. And so you start to figure this out. And so when people say that Lewis never wrote the book, I think Lewis began to write the book and he picked some of the great passages, the fight scene in Montana, seeing the mountains for the first time, and he wrote those. And then for whatever reason, he stalled out
and fell apart.
At the same time, he wants to make sure that everyone gets it, that it's Lewis's journey and Lewis's discoveries. And trying to sort that out was going to be very difficult. And there's some fallout from it. Because remember, when Nicholas Biddle writes to Clark and says, there's this kind of weird thing about your being a captain, and I know you weren't really a captain. How do you want me to handle that? Clark's response is stern and self-protective, and he's got some angst about his companion, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, and he also, during that Biddle publication phase, also took great pains, especially the so-called Kamehameha geography lesson.
Yes.
Where the Shoshone chief explains all that they're about to encounter west of the divide. Lewis writes it up as if he had elucidated that, or elicited that information from Kamehameha. And Clark writes right in Lewis's journal half a decade later, all that you see here, I actually got by virtue of Sacagawea's help.
That's his sternest rebuke to Lewis's aggrandizing of himself. And I think you are the pioneer of that one, too. The good news is, Dave, we probably lost everybody when we were collecting vials of water in this program at different sources of different rivers. But for those who have remained, I love this conversation. Thank you. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.